The anomaly was small enough that it should never have been found. A signals intelligence analyst working a routine review of encrypted communication traffic flagged for secondary assessment noticed a pattern. Not in the content of the communications, which remained encrypted, but in their timing. 17 separate encrypted transmissions, originating from 16 different registered sender identities across 9 countries, had been sent within a 40-minute window on the same Tuesday evening. The registered identities were all connected, on paper, to a humanitarian logistics coordination platform used by multiple international NGOs, operating under United Nations frameworks in conflict-affected regions. The platform was legitimate. The organizations using it were legitimate. The timing pattern was not. Legitimate operational communications from humanitarian logistics platforms do not cluster in 17 transmission bursts across 9 countries at 11:20 p.m. on a Tuesday. Operational communications follow the rhythms of the working day, the rhythms of field operations, the rhythms of whatever crisis is being managed. They do not synchronize across time zones unless something is being coordinated. Something that requires all 17 parties to transmit within the same 40-minute window at a time, when no documented humanitarian emergency was active in any of the 9 countries involved. The analysts flagged it. The flag reached Secret Elite's counterintelligence assessment desk within 6 hours. And within 48 hours, Secret Elite's analytical team had begun to understand that the transmission pattern was not an anomaly at all. It was a heartbeat. It was the regular, patterned pulse of an operational coordination network that had been running inside the humanitarian and international organizational infrastructure for an estimated 4 years. Hidden in the transmission traffic of platforms whose sheer volume of legitimate activity made it almost impossible to identify the illegitimate signals running through the same infrastructure. What Secret Elite was looking at was not a small operation. Over the following 13 weeks, the most operationally complex counterintelligence investigation the unit had conducted across international organizational infrastructure. It would be revealed as a systematic Iranian intelligence program that had successfully placed, cultivated, or compromised assets inside 11 United Nations affiliated organizations, 7 independent international NGOs, and 2 multilateral financial monitoring bodies whose mandate included tracking sanctions compliance for Iranian-connected entities. The architecture was elegant in its use of institutional legitimacy as cover. Iranian intelligence had not tried to build a parallel infrastructure. It had not created fake organizations or inserted obviously suspicious personnel. It had identified the specific, functional roles within international, humanitarian, and organizational systems that offered the most valuable combination of access and unscrutinized mobility. And it had patiently placed, over a period of years, individuals into those roles through the entirely legitimate processes those organizations use to recruit staff, accept volunteers, onboard contractors, and bring in consultants. The roles that had been prioritized were not the senior visible positions. Iranian intelligence had specifically targeted the mid-tier operational layer, the logistics coordinators who managed the movement of supplies, personnel, and documentation across borders. The data analysts who had read access to beneficiary databases and field operational records. The finance officers at the level below senior management who processed transactions that their superiors approved without detailed review. The communications officers who managed the encrypted platforms through which field operations were coordinated. And the grant compliance monitors who had access to detailed reporting on where international funding was going and what it was being used for. Across the 11 UN-affiliated organizations and 7 NGOs, Secret Elite's analysis eventually confirmed 23 individuals operating as active or passive assets for Iranian intelligence. 14 of them had been recruited through a method that Secret Elite's analysts documented as a refined evolution of the same ideological cultivation approach that had been used against the State Department employees. Long-term relationship building through academic, professional, and advocacy networks, with an ideological framing that positioned the intelligence work as moral resistance rather than betrayal. 6 had been recruited through financial leverage, personal financial situations that Iranian intelligence had identified and then carefully exploited. 3 had been recruited through personal relationships with Iranian nationals who were themselves Iranian intelligence assets. The operational product that these 23 individuals had been providing over the course of the network's active period was comprehensive in ways that Secret Elite's analysts found genuinely alarming. The logistics coordinators had been providing route and schedule information for humanitarian convoys in conflict regions. Information that had, in at least 2 documented cases confirmed through forensic reconstruction, been used to enable the movement of Iranian-connected materiel through the same corridors under cover of the humanitarian traffic. The finance officers had been providing detailed information about the financial flows of organizations that were recipients of international funding in regions where Iranian proxy networks were active. Information that allowed Iranian intelligence to map the funding landscape and identify targets for influence operations. The grant compliance monitors had been providing access to reporting that exposed the operational details of programs run by organizations that were, in some cases, also collecting information on Iranian-backed networks as part of their operational remit. The most operationally damaging product had come from the 2 assets placed inside the multilateral financial monitoring bodies. Both organizations were involved, in different capacities, in monitoring compliance with international sanctions frameworks that included Iranian financial entities. One asset was a data analyst with read access to the compliance monitoring database. The other was a communications officer whose access to the platform through which member states submitted sanctions, compliance reports, gave Iranian intelligence a real-time window into what the international community knew and did not know about Iranian sanctions. Evasion infrastructure. For an estimated 3 years, Iranian intelligence had known in advance which Iranian-connected financial entities were under active compliance scrutiny. It had known which accounts were flagged, which transactions were being reviewed, and in some cases, which investigations were approaching the point at which formal referrals to member state law enforcement would be made. That advanced knowledge had been used to move assets, restructure entities, and sanitize financial trails before scrutiny could produce actionable enforcement outcomes. The sanctions evasion operations that had been protected by this intelligence access were not peripheral. They were connected to the financial infrastructure supporting Iranian-backed proxy organizations in Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. The total value of financial flows that had been protected from enforcement action through the intelligence provided by the 2 monitoring body assets was assessed by Secret Elite's financial forensics team at between $340 million and $480 million over the 3-year active period. Funds that had moved through the international financial system, unimpeded specifically because Iranian intelligence knew exactly where the scrutiny was and had routed around it. $340 million, minimum. Moving through international financial infrastructure to fund organizations whose activities had directly affected civilian populations in 4 conflict zones. Protected by 2 people with database and communications access, inside organizations whose entire purpose was to prevent exactly that kind of movement. Secret Elite's operational planning for the interdiction was complicated by the institutional environment in which the network operated. International organizations exist in a specific legal and diplomatic space, a space in which national law enforcement jurisdiction is constrained, in which the organizations themselves have institutional interests in their own integrity and reputation that do not always align neatly with the requirements of a counterintelligence operation, and in which the international dimension of the network meant that any coordinated action required either the active cooperation or the carefully managed non-interference of governments whose relationship with the relevant intelligence was complex. The planning phase lasted 6 weeks. During that 6 weeks, Secret Elite worked through diplomatic and intelligence channels with partner services in 14 countries to build the legal and operational framework for a simultaneous interdiction that would cover all 23 identified assets, the financial infrastructure supporting the network, and the Iranian intelligence officers who managed the network from postings in 4 countries, while simultaneously notifying and coordinating with the relevant international organizations in a way that protected the integrity of the evidence and prevented premature disclosure. That last element, the coordination with the international organizations themselves, was handled through a channel that Secret Elite had never previously used at this scale. Senior officials at 4 of the most significantly affected organizations were briefed under the most stringent confidentiality protocols available, through a process that bypassed the organization's normal security and communications infrastructure entirely to prevent any risk of the briefings reaching compromised personnel. Those officials, all of whom Secret Elite's counterintelligence assessment confirmed were clean, were given the minimum information necessary to enable their cooperation with the operational plan and to prepare the internal response that would be required when the arrests became public. The financial interdiction component was the most geographically complex element. The network's financial support infrastructure, the mechanism through which Iranian intelligence compensated its assets and moved the operational funds required to maintain the network, operated through a layered structure of shell companies, cryptocurrency wallets, and correspondent banking relationships spread across 17 countries. Tracing it had required the cooperation of financial intelligence units in 9 countries, and had taken 11 of the 13 weeks of the investigation to reconstruct with sufficient confidence to support simultaneous interdiction. On the morning the operation launched, working through Interpol financial intelligence channels and bilateral financial intelligence partnerships, Secret Elite coordinated the simultaneous freezing of 54 financial accounts and 31 cryptocurrency wallets across 17 countries. The total value of assets frozen in the initial interdiction was approximately $23 million. The operational float of the network's compensation and support infrastructure. The larger flows, connected to the sanctions evasion protection, were the subject of separate enforcement actions, coordinated through the multilateral financial monitoring bodies themselves, which had been prepared in the 6-week planning phase to execute the enforcement referrals that the compromise monitoring process had prevented from reaching completion. The arrests were synchronized across 11 countries. All 23 assets were taken into custody within a 15-minute window, coordinated through encrypted satellite uplink across every relevant time zone. The logistics required to synchronize arrests in Geneva, Nairobi, Amman, Bangkok, Bogota, Vienna, Beirut, Jakarta, Brussels, Ottawa, and 3 additional cities within a 15-minute window, while ensuring that none of the 23 targets had any communication with the others during the window, represented a coordination achievement that Secret Elite's operations team documented in the internal debrief as unprecedented in the unit's operational history. 17 of the 23 arrests were clean. Subjects taken into custody with no resistance. Communication devices secured before activation. 4 subjects attempted to use encrypted communication devices before arrest teams reached them. None of those activation attempts succeeded. The devices were secured and the data recovered from them provided, as had been the case in previous operations, intelligence that substantially expanded the map of the Iranian network's global infrastructure beyond what Secret Elite had identified during the investigation. 2 subjects evaded initial arrest. Both were located and detained within 41 hours of the primary operation through follow-on surveillance and partner service coordination. The data recovered from their devices during those 41 hours, before Iranian intelligence could confirm that the entire network had been rolled up and could take steps to sanitize communications, was assessed as the most valuable intelligence product of the entire operation. The Iranian intelligence officers managing the network from their diplomatic postings could not be arrested, but they were identified, their cover burned, and their operational files, reconstructed from the 23 arrested assets' devices and communications logs, and from the intelligence contributed by 14 partner services, were shared with the international organizations that had been infiltrated, and with the member state governments whose sanctions enforcement frameworks had been compromised. All 4 were expelled from their postings within 35 days of the operation. The host countries that expelled them issued formal diplomatic protests through appropriate channels. The international organizations that had been infiltrated faced an institutional reckoning that Secret Elite had prepared support for during the planning phase. The internal review processes that 4 of those organizations launched in the weeks following the operation were supported by counterintelligence consultation that Secret Elite provided through appropriately sanitized channels consultation that focused specifically on the structural vulnerabilities in mid-tier operational hiring and access management that the Iranian network had systematically exploited. 3 of the 4 organizations implemented significant structural changes to their internal security frameworks within 90 days. The sanctions enforcement actions that the compromised monitoring process had prevented from reaching completion were, in the months following the operation, restarted and completed without interference. The financial entities that had been shielded by 3 years of advance. Warning no longer had a window into the compliance monitoring process. The enforcement actions that followed represented the most significant sanctions. Compliance enforcement activity in the relevant frameworks in several years. Enforcement activity that had been systematically blocked for 3 years by 2 people with database and communications access. What had been prevented, what had almost continued indefinitely, was the systematic hollowing of the international institutional infrastructure that the global community relies on to manage conflict, protect vulnerable populations, and enforce the rules that are supposed to constrain the behavior of states that fund violence and destabilization. For 4 years, that infrastructure had contained a parasite, 23 people across 11 organizations in 11 countries, providing a real-time intelligence picture to an Iranian intelligence operation that used it to protect financial flows, compromise humanitarian corridors, and systematically frustrate the enforcement mechanisms designed to limit the resources available to proxy networks that operate in civilian environments. The 40-minute transmission burst that a signals intelligence analyst flagged on a Tuesday evening, the heartbeat of a network that had been running invisibly for 4 years, was the thread that unraveled it. That analyst did not know what they were looking at. They knew only that the pattern was wrong. They flagged it, because that is what the protocol required. Secret Elite did the rest. 13 weeks, 11 countries, 23 arrests in 15 minutes, 54 accounts frozen, a sanctions enforcement gap closed, an institutional infiltration exposed and repaired, the financial flows that had moved unimpeded toward conflict zone proxy networks for 3 years, blocked. The world's humanitarian and international organizational infrastructure is not invulnerable. It is, in fact, an attractive target precisely because its legitimacy and complexity make it difficult to scrutinize without appearing to undermine the work it does. Iranian intelligence understood that. It built a network inside that infrastructure that was patient, sophisticated, and almost invisible. Almost. Secret Elite found the heartbeat, and in 15 minutes, it stopped it. This is a fictional dramatization inspired by international law enforcement and intelligence cooperation concepts. No real operations, agencies, task forces, or individuals are depicted. All characters, organizations, and events are entirely fictional and created for narrative purposes. If international humanitarian infrastructure is specifically targeted for infiltration, because its legitimacy makes it difficult to scrutinize without appearing hostile to the work it does. How do you design oversight systems that protect that work without creating the blind spots that make infiltration possible in the first place? When 23 people across 11 organizations in 11 countries can collectively protect $340 million in sanctioned financial flows for 3 years before anyone finds the thread. What does that tell us about the gap between the rules the international system operates under and the reality of how state-sponsored intelligence operations exploit those rules? And how many other heartbeats are running right now inside infrastructure the world trusts, waiting for someone to notice the pattern? Subscribe to Secret Elite for more heroic intervention stories about operations that saved lives the world never knew were at risk. Where evil operates in the shadows, Secret Elite is already there, working before the threat becomes the tragedy. Hashtag Secret Elite. Hashtag heroic intervention. Hashtag rescue operation. Hashtag international justice. Hashtag counterintelligence. Hashtag network dismantled. Hashtag global coordination. Hashtag true crime. Hashtag justice. Hashtag you. End infiltration. Hashtag sanctions evasion. Hashtag Iranian intelligence.